أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، حمدا كثيرا طيبا طاهرا مباركا فيه، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من لدنك علما نافعا يا أرحم الراحمين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and peace and blessings be upon his beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Inshallah ta'ala, continuing with the fiqh of tahara and salat, and we towards the end of the fiqh of tahara, and the last chapter to mention inshallah is ahkamul hayd wal nifas wal istihada, is the rulings related to the menstruation and so forth, and what rulings are related to these subjects: postnatal bleeding and irregular bleeding as well. So these three, inshallah ta'ala, we'll try to finish them today, and we'll try to, as much as we can, shed light onto these issues, because it's also something that unfortunately a lot of people are ignorant about. A lot of people don't know the ahkam and the ruling related to these day-to-day things that can befall the Muslim or the Muslimah in this case. And the ahkam or the rulings related to these subjects are of great importance, especially for the female to learn and to understand. If not, it is obligatory upon the female to learn the rulings related to al-hayd wal-istihada wal-nifas. Now first is what we call al-hayd. Al-hayd is the menstrual bleeding that the female sees after reaching the age of puberty up until the age of menopause. The age of puberty, as the ulama have mentioned, is 9. Most popular is 9, and the maximum in which both the male and the female can stay without having reached physically the age of puberty is 15. Meaning that if a boy or a male reaches the age of 15 and hasn't physically reached the age of puberty, then he is considered to be the age of puberty at the age of 15. And same thing with the female, the girl. Meaning if the girl doesn't see any bleeding and she reaches the age of 15, then she is considered to have reached the age of puberty. So here, reaching the age of puberty is either by a physical action that takes place. The females, it's bleeding. With the males, it's seeing a wet dream or so forth. So if the person doesn't see that, the boy or the girl doesn't see that, and they reach the age of 15, from the age of 15 onwards, they are considered to have reached the age of puberty. Doesn't matter. So here with the hayd, with the menstruation, it's something that takes place with the female from the age of puberty, or when she reaches puberty up until the age of menopause, which is 55 years old. This bleeding that takes place is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created in the female. It's an ibtila from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's there for a purpose and a reason. And for the female, as the menstruation bleeding is the bleeding that takes place from the rahim. It's the bleeding that happens from the rahim, which is from the womb of the female, that it takes out any eggs that the female had that hadn't been utilized by the husband or by so forth, and it takes out any of that which is in the womb at that time. And that's why the bleeding takes place, it cleans. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during that period of time has lightened upon the female certain obligations. Certain obligations have been lightened or removed, or she's not required to do certain things during that time. Because most of the females during that time go through some pains. And they go through different emotions and so forth. It's something that the whole body feels. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during this time, there's certain things that you don't have to do and you're not obligated to do, and we'll go through them shortly inshallah. So here al-hayd, the ulama or the fuqaha of the ahnaf, they gave the definition of al-hayd: dam yakhruj min rahim imra'a baligha la da'a biha wa la habl. It's the bleeding or the blood that comes out from the womb of the female who has reached the age of puberty with no sickness. She has no sickness and she is not pregnant and she hasn't reached the age of menopause. No sickness because there are certain sicknesses, certain things that can take place that can make the female bleed. Or wala habl, because during pregnancy there's no menstruation. Any bleeding that is seen during pregnancy is irregular bleeding, doesn't take the rulings of hayd, and hasn't reached the age of puberty, because if she has reached the age of puberty then it's also considered as irregular bleeding. So here, before we continue, there's hayd, which is menstruation, which is the regular bleeding that the female sees every month or every 2 months, or to her monthly period of time. And we have istihada, which is called, or which is meant as irregular bleeding, meaning bleeding that takes place outside of menstruation. And then you have nifas, which is the postnatal bleeding, which is the bleeding that takes place after giving birth. And each one has different rulings and different regulations, a minimum, a maximum, and so forth. The description of the blood of hayd, of menstruation, is that it is red, closer to darkness or closer to being black. It's darker in color, it's thick, and it has not a good smell. Not a good smell. That which is yellowish or lighter in color in the duration of hayd is considered as what? As hayd. Outside of menstruation, it's considered as irregular bleeding. It's considered as irregular bleeding. The duration that the hayd takes place. When sisters call and they ask, is it hayd, is it not hayd? You say, the sister knows the difference between the menstruation blood and the blood which is not menstruation, because they are two very different types of bleeding. The characteristics and so forth are very different. So is it hayd, is it not hayd? You can tell the difference. The female, she's able to tell the difference, inshaAllah. The duration, and some of the hardest questions that we get on the phone is when females call and they ask about their hayd. My menstruation, it stopped this time, it went this time, it came that time, it went this time, kada. Tell me, here, talk to my wife. Tell her what's happening. She'll answer you. Or talk to a female, talk to someone. The duration that the menstruation takes place. Is there a maximum, is there a minimum, or is there not? The most common duration of hayd, as mentioned in different ahadith by the Prophet ﷺ, is 6 to 7 days. Between 6 and 7 days is the most common duration of menstruation. But the ulama, there is difference of opinion. What is the minimum? What is the maximum? The ahnaf, the minimum of hayd is 3 days and nights. 3 days and 3 nights. And the maximum is 10 days and 10 nights. The Shafi'iyya, they said that the minimum is 1 day and night, and the maximum is 15 days, 15 nights. Now, are there sort of authentic ahadith which mention the duration? There is not. The Ahnaf, they have based their opinion on certain ahadith, but these ahadith are weak. But they said we rather use the weak ahadith than go upon our opinion. And Shafi'iyya said, no, we've taken the opinion of the females, the nisa, and we've asked the nisa, and their reply was minimum 1, maximum 15. So there's quite a difference between the two. Between 10 and 15 there's 5 days. 5 days and nights. So each one has the opinion, and each one has the dalil. And the most common, as I said, these are the two most common opinions out there. The Ahnaf and the Shafi'iyya are the most two common opinions that the people, they follow. So here, when we say the minimum is 3 days, meaning that from the day that the female sees the menstruation blood, she stops all the religious matters that she is able to do until at least 3 days pass. Meaning that if the hayd comes and it's 100% it's hayd, then she cannot consider it to be purity for less than what? 3 days and 3 nights. 3 days and 3 nights. And the Shafi'iyya said 1 day, 1 night. If after it she sees tuhur, she sees purity and so forth, then she considers it as what? She considers it as tahara. And here, why is it important? Why is it important to know when is there haid and when is there not haid? Because during the haid, as we'll come to see, there's no praying for the female, no fasting, no recitation of the Qur'an, no touching of the Qur'an, no marital relations, no entering into the masjid, and so forth. All of these things are related to the female during the time of menstruation. So that's why the ulama have emphasized very strongly on the females to learn these matters. And very important for the female to be cautious of when it stops, when it begins. Why? Because when it stops, when the period finishes, she's gone, the female now, it's obligated upon her to what? To pray. It's obligated upon her to fast. So she can't delay it. She can't delay it. Or she can't say that, I'll shower later. Because when we took the rulings of ghusl, the obligatory shower, we said that the obligatory shower has to be performed. One of the reasons why it has to be performed is for the female when she sees the purity after menstruating, or she sees the purity after postnatal bleeding. Now it's obligatory for her to what? To perform ghusl. Like the man, if the man has marital relations, then in order for him to pray, he can still fast, but in order for him to pray, he has to perform ghusl. And a lot of men, they delay it. A lot of men, they perform the marital relations and then they delay it. The time for prayer comes, they leave it. They wait, they get there, and they don't perform ghusl, or they leave it. And this is from the importance of tahara in Islam. That's why Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, "At-taharatu shatrul iman." Purity is half of iman. Half of iman. That's why the Muslim is always what? Is always performing wudu, performing ghusl. We mentioned the hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He said it is the right upon Allah for every Muslim to perform ghusl at least once a week. Washes his hair, washes his body, and cleans himself. Why? Because Islam is a religion of tahara, of purification. The person at least 2, 3 times a day washes their arms, their feet, their face, their head, their ears, their nose, their mouth, at least 3, 4 times a day. They perform these actions. One side of it is a physical purification, to remove any dirt, to remove anything, and the other side of it is a spiritual purification. A spiritual purification. And that's the same as the 5 prayers. That's why Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, one hadith, subhanAllah, it shows you how Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam used to use with the Sahaba practical examples. He said, imagine a man has a river in front of his house, and he goes every day, he goes 5 times a day to that river and washes himself. Do you think that man would have any dirt on him after that? Hadith sahih. So do you think any man would have يبقى على جسده من درنه شيء? You think he'll have any dirt remaining on his body? قالوا لا يا رسول الله. They said no. 5 times a day going out and washing? Of course not. He said that is the example of the 5 prayers. That is the example of the 5 prayers. Spiritual cleansing. That's why it's very important for the sisters to always be cautious of what? To be cautious of their timings and when the menstruation comes and when it doesn't come. Another question that is asked, is it a condition of continuous, that it has to be, the bleeding has to be continuous in order for it to be considered as menstruation? It is not a condition. A lot of the sisters, they call, I haven't seen any bleeding for such and such, does that mean I'm pure? No. Continuous or continuity is not a condition. It's not that there's going to be continuous bleeding. No. It can stop for an hour, 2, 3, 4, 5 hours without seeing anything, and then it could come back. So it's not a condition that it is what? That it is continuous, always, and so forth. So that's not a condition. طب نحن when we say purity, what do we mean? Purity here can be identified by two ways. Either the female sees tuhur, she sees the purity, which is the white strip, she sees the purity, or complete dryness. There's nothing, no bleeding, nothing there whatsoever. One of those two is an identification of what? Of purity. And when we say purity here, we mean the ending of menstruation, the ending of the period for the female, or the ending of the nifas, and so forth. So purity here most commonly is identified by seeing the purity itself, by physically seeing the purity, or by complete dryness. But is there a minimum for purity? Meaning a female, she's gone through her cycle, 7-8 days, finished her cycle, saw the purity, now she's gone into her period of tuhur. Is there a minimum for tuhur? There is a minimum for tuhur that the ulama agree upon, that it is 15 days. 15 days and nights. Meaning that after the female sees her purity from a cycle for 15 days and night, minimum, it's a period of what? Tuhur. Meaning anything that the female sees during that time is considered what? Irregular bleeding. Is considered as irregular bleeding, that she prays, she fasts, and so forth. It's just that if there is that irregular bleeding, as we'll come to say, that she has to make wudu, renew her wudu, renew her kada for every prayer. So here there is a minimum, which is what? Which is 15 days. 15 days minimum for tuhur. So when you calculate it, it's very, unfortunately, one thing that causes irregularity in the periods and irregularity in the bleeding is, unfortunately, medication. A lot of people take medication, a lot of people use contraceptions, a lot of people use different things. That affects the bleeding in a big way, because you're playing with the natural cycle of things. You're playing with how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has naturally made the female. And one of the biggest effects, one of the biggest things that changes the bleeding is contraception. Contraception from the female side. That is something that plays a big role in the changing of the bleeding, to the extent where a female used to have normal bleeding 6-7 days every month, normal, and then after having contraception, whether it's by pills, whether it's by injections, whether IUDs, whatever it is, that changes, and within 3, 4, 5 months she has 1 day every month or 2 months, or 2 days every month or 2 months. So it changes the chemical and the natural state of the human being. So that's one thing that plays a big role. And then as well, normal medication. Normal medication, the food that we eat and all that, it all plays a role on the bleeding. So here the female, she has to take upon herself that, okay, the minimum for haid is, she takes the opinion of the Ahnaf, 3 days. The maximum is 10 days. The minimum of tuhur agreed upon between the ulama is what? 15 days. And then she bases her bleeding and so forth upon that, differentiating between what is irregular bleeding and what is not irregular bleeding. With regards to nifas, which is the postnatal bleeding, which is the bleeding that takes place after pregnancy or after giving birth, and nifas linguistically in Arabic means al-wilada, giving birth. Linguistically, nifas means giving birth. In the Islamic terminology, it is the blood that comes out after giving birth, or after the majority of the child being born. So here, anything that the female sees, and this is a question that is always asked, anything the female sees prior to giving birth, actually physically giving birth, any bleeding that is prior to that is considered irregular bleeding. Is considered istihada. Meaning that she still has to pray, she still has to do her obligations that is upon her during that time. So any bleeding, as we said, that is prior to giving birth is considered as irregular bleeding. But if the female gives birth and she doesn't see any blood, which is very rare or is not common, if a female was to give birth and there was to be no bleeding, she was to see no bleeding, then according to Imam Abu Hanifa and the majority of ulama, that she still has to perform ghusl. She still has to perform ghusl ihtiyatan, meaning that she still has to, because giving birth is something that there's always going to be some blood. There's always going to be some blood. Anyone who's witnessed or anyone who's seen their wife giving birth will know that there's going to be some blood. There's going to be some blood. Unfortunately, these days they invite the husband in now. Tfaddal, come in. Come see, watch your wife giving birth. Come. Allahu musta'an. Now, so if the female gives birth and doesn't see any blood, then she still has to what? She still has to make ghusl before praying or doing anything that is religiously restricted upon her during the period of nifas. The minimal of nifas, is there a minimum? There's no minimum according to the majority of ulama. The female can give birth and the next day she can what? Be pure. And she continues praying and fasting and everything. So there's no minimal to postnatal bleeding. There's no minimal to nifas. The maximum of nifas, also the Ahnaf and the Shafi'iyya have two opinions. The Ahnaf are that the maximum of nifas is 40 days. The maximum of nifas is 40 days. Meaning that anything beyond 40 days is considered irregular bleeding. She has to perform ghusl, pray and so forth. The Shafi'iyya, they said that the maximum of nifas is 60 days. 60 days. There's a big difference, 20 days difference. From 40 to 60, there's 20 days different. The Ahnaf, they use the hadith of Salama, where she said, كانت النفساء تقعد على عهد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم 40 يوما إلا أن ترى طهرا قبل ذلك. Salama, she said that the female used to sit. تقعد. تقعد here means wouldn't pray or fast on the time of the Prophet ﷺ for 40 days, except if she sees purity prior. Except if she sees purity prior to 40 days. And the hadith is in the Sunan. The Shafi'iyya, they said that the hadith of Salama is the most common, but not the maximum. So they said the maximum is what? And it's rare that it will go until 60 days. That it will go, but it's a rare occasion that it will go up until 60 days. So that's the maximum. The Ahnaf say 40, the Shafi'iyya say it is 60. Tayyib. One of the rulings that the ulama they mention is if a female was to give birth to twins, is the postnatal bleeding from the first child or from the second child? Is it considered from the first child or is it considered from the second child? Most commonly we know that twins are born after each other. There's not that much time or gap between them. Could be minutes, could be hours. But in rare occasions it could be days. It could be days between the first child, if there's twins between the first child being born and between the second. Most commonly 5 minutes, 10 minutes. But in occasions it could go beyond that. It could go for days until the second child is born. So when does the nifas begin? From the first or from the second child? The Shafi'iyya and Abu Hanifa, they are of the opinion that it's from the first child. From the first child is born, the nifas is counted from then. What is istihada? What is irregular bleeding? Istihada is irregular bleeding that takes place outside of the normal or natural times of bleeding, which is menstruation and nifas. So any bleeding outside of those is considered as irregular bleeding, istihada. So if a female was to see blood for less than a day and a night, then according to the Shafi'iyya it's istihada. Or less than 3 days and 3 nights, then according to the Ahnaf it's what? Istihada. Or if she sees blood for more than 10 days, according to the Hanafi madhab, it's what? Istihada. More than 15 days in the Shafi'i madhab, it's considered as istihada. Or if a female sees bleeding for more than 40 days after giving birth, in the Hanafi madhab, it's what? Istihada. more than 60 in the Shafi'i madhab, it's considered as istihada. And that's meaning what? Meaning that she has to perform ghusl and continue or go back to her religious obligations. Religious obligations. Like if a female, here the ada, most commonly within females there's a set routine. Set routine. That it comes for 6 days, finishes, comes purity 28 days, and then comes for 6 days, and then kada, and so forth. It goes in a cycle. It's usually what? It's usually a routine. So if a female, her routine was 5 days, or her routine was 6 days, and one time she saw that her bleeding went until 9 days. Went until 9 days. If it goes more than 10 days, then it is all considered as istihada. Meaning, repeat again, her normal cycle was 7 days. Normal cycle was 7 days. One time it came and it was more than 10 days. More than what? More than 10 days. If it goes over 10 days, then she has to make up the prayers from the 7th day. She has to go back to the 7th day. 7th day, that was the finishing. Then after that, it's all considered what? Istihada. It's all considered istihada. If the female, her regular cycle was 7 days, and then it continued and it stopped at 9 days. Now her regular cycle is what? 9 days. So here the cycle is confirmed, the changing of it is confirmed by one time. Meaning she used to see it for 7 days, then one time it came 9 days, her cycle now is what? 9 days. So then if it goes back to 7 days, then it goes back down to what? 7 days. So تثبت العادة بمرة. It's what? Changed by one time. So again, if the female, her routine was 7 days, and then it went over 10 days, she has to go back and make up those prayers. She has to go back and make up those prayers. If it became less than 10 days, then that means that her what? Her routine has shifted to 9 or 8 or whatever it is. Very simple. If it goes over 10 days, she has to make up those prayers. If it's less than 10 days, then her change or her cycle has changed. Very simple. And the Shafi'i madhab, it's exactly the same, but what? 15. It's exactly the same, but 15. So that's why it's very important for the female to always observe. To always observe and to learn the ahkam of what? Of hayd and nifas and istihada. The duration of the istihada, the duration of irregular bleeding, due to the fact that it is irregular bleeding, there is no minimal or maximum to it. Some females are on a continuous state of irregular bleeding. Continuous. Throughout the whole year, they always have irregular bleeding. Some, it's a medical condition. Some, it's a sickness. And others, it's just irregular bleeding that comes and goes. But there's no minimal or maximum to the irregular bleeding, to the istihada, like there is for the hayd and like there is for the nifas. But what is prohibited due to there being menstruation or postnatal bleeding? First and foremost, prayer. The ulama are of agreement, consensus, that it is haram, not that it's not allowed or that it's she doesn't have to. It's haram to pray on a female that is in a state of hayd or nifas. Praying in a state of hayd, menstruation or nifas, postnatal bleeding, is haram. Whether it is a fard or a nafila. A fard prayer or a sunnah prayer, janazah prayer, sajdat tilawa, sajdat sukur, anything that is related to prayer is haram. Why? Because the Nabi ﷺ, he said, إِذَا أَقْبَلَتِ الْحَيْضَ فَاتْرُكِ الصَّلَاةِ. If the haida comes, then leave the prayer. And the obligation of prayer is lifted off them. Meaning that they don't have to what? They don't have to make it up. The days that she is in a state of menstruation, or the days that she's in a state of nifas, those days she doesn't have to make up the prayers. Because that will be difficult. for a female, every month she has to make up 6, 7, 8 days of prayers, which is a large number, over 20, between 20, 30 prayers. The 5 prayers, and people struggle. Tell them, come and you have to make up all those prayers before, and you have to pray them. That's going to be a hara. So it's a rahmah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they don't have to make it. And the reason why, or the proof that they don't have to make it up, is the hadith or the narration of Aisha, that she said, كنا نحيد عند رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فلا نقضي ولا نؤمر بالقضاء. We used to have our menstruation in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, and he wouldn't order us to make up the prayers, and we wouldn't make up those prayers. Secondly, it is haram to also, as the consensus between the ulama, to fast. Meaning that here, if a female comes and prays during her haid, she is committing a what? She is committing a sin. And if a female comes, or if a female says that, no, it's not haram to pray, it's permissible to pray during menstruation, that's kufr. If a female prays intentionally, knowing that it's haram, that she shouldn't, then it's a sin. It's a major sin. And if she says, no, it's not haram, I can pray, and praying is permissible, there's no difference between men and women, and they begin all that, that talk and that speech, then that can lead to kufr. That can lead to kufr. So fasting and salat is haram. Whether it's a obligatory fasting or it's a what? It's a sunnah fasting. For the narration of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, أليس إذا حاضت إحداكن لم تصلي ولم تصم ولم تصم ولم تصلي قال أو قلنا بلى. And this is regarding the hadith of النساء ناقصات عقل ودين. That the females are, when it comes to the aql, which is the shahada, which is the testification, it's when it comes to the males and the females, there's different. And when it comes to the deen, they asked the Prophet ﷺ, what do you mean that we are less in deen? So the females took it in the wrong way, as the females today take it in the wrong way. And what do you mean, نحن ناقصات عقل ودين? They think straight away that what, you're saying we're crazy? You're saying that we're not religious? For Nabi ﷺ, he replied to her. He said, أليست إحداكن إذا حاضت لم تصلي ولم تصم. He said, isn't it the fact that if one of you falls in a state of menstruation, she doesn't fast or she doesn't pray? They said, yes, Ya Rasulullah. He said, فَذَلِكُنَّ or فَذَلِكُمْ مِن نُقْصَانِ دِينِهَا. That's the reason for the deen. Because she doesn't pray and she doesn't fast during those days. Meaning that there are days that come that the female doesn't fast and doesn't pray. That's why her deen is what? Less. Very simple. Very what? Very simple. There's no hidden agenda in the Sharia that no, the females are this or the females are that. But the difference with fasting is that during the menstruation, if the fasting is obligatory like Ramadan, then that fasting has to be what? Made up. They has to make that fasting up, because it's not, she has 11 months between Ramadan and Ramadan to make up those days. To make up the days of fasting. As Aisha radiallahu anha, she says, كنا نؤمر بقضاء الصوم ولا نؤمر بقضاء الصلاة. We used to be ordered by Prophet ﷺ to what? To make up our fasting, but not to make up our praying. So the praying or the fasting has to be made up, but the praying doesn't have to be made up. Thirdly, recitation of the Qur'an. It is prohibited for the female during the state of haid or nifas, and also the man in the state of janaba, major impurity, to recite the Qur'an. For the hadith of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, that the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تقرأ الحائض ولا الجنب شيئا من القرآن. That the haid, menstruating female, and the junub, the person in major impurity, are not to recite anything from the Qur'an. Are not to recite anything from the Qur'an. And that which is prohibited from recitation is the actual recitation of the Qur'an. And it's sit and recite the Fatiha, or to recite an ayah that this is, I'm reciting the Qur'an. But if it was to come on the tongue unintentionally, then that is something that is not considered as a what? as they seen. But to sit down, no, I'm in janaba, I'm in major impurity and I want to recite. Like some people they call, subhanallah, some sisters they call, and why, and I want to recite Qur'an, I'm in the state of haid, I'm in the state of kada in Ramadan. I want to read Qur'an but kada, but I can't because I'm in the state of haid. And what can I do, what can I tell sister? Do you have the same enthusiasm for reciting outside of your time of menstruation? And that's when they pause. You don't have that enthusiasm. Why now do you have that enthusiasm? And now you want to recite? Now you want to recite? Now you can't recite, I want to recite now. And when you can recite, I don't want to recite. احترنا معكم. So the recitation of the Qur'an during that period of time is what? Or is prohibited. If it comes unintentionally, that's fine. Or if it's done with the intention of dua. Like a person was to make dua, Allahumma ighfir li wa li walidayya. That's a dua, or that's verses from the Qur'an. So making a dua that is from, or with the intention of dua is allowed. Or praising of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or if someone was, a calamity was to befall them and then they say inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That's from the what? From the Qur'an. But that's permitted. That's permissible. So if it's in dua, it's in praising, remembrance of Allah, or at the time of a musibah, then it's what? Then it's permissible. Or if the person is in their car, jumping in their car, traveling, or going on a plane traveling and makes the dua, Subhanalladhi sakhkhara lana hadha wa ma kunna lahu muqrinin wa inna ila rabbina lamunqalibun. That's a verse in what? In the Qur'an. So saying that even in a time of menstruation or major impurity is permissible. Or Rabbi ighfir li wa li waliday. Why? Because that's not recited or said with the intention of what? With the intention of reciting the Qur'an. And that's why the ulama are of consensus that it's permissible to do tasbih or takbir or tahleel or even praise the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for the female who's in janaba or nifas, menstruating, personal bleeding and so forth. Tasbih, tahleel, kada. You want to recite the Qur'an. You can't recite the Qur'an now. Why don't you do tasbih? Do tahleel. Do salat ala nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Praise the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he mentioned many virtues for the one that praises, sends salat ala nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. One of the most amazing ahadith that mentions the virtue of praising the Prophet ﷺ is a sahabi came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, Ya Rasulullah, inni aj'alu laka min salati, or aj'alu laka rub'a salati. And when he said, Ya Rasulullah, when I make dua, I say 1/4 of my dua, I praise you. He praises the Prophet ﷺ. So Nabi ﷺ, he says, is that enough? He says, that's good, and if you increase, then it's better. He says, I'll make half or 1/3. He said, that's good. If you increase, it's better. He said, I'll make half. Person, he's making dua for 10 minutes. 5 minutes is salat ala nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or praising the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he says, that's fine. And if you increase, then it's better. ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ وَإِن زِدْتَ فَأَفْضَلٌ. If you increase, it's better. He said, make 3/3. He said, that's good. If you increase, then it's better. He said, أَوْ أَجْعَلُ قَالَ يَا رَسُولَ أَجْعَلُ لَكَ صَلَاتِي كُلَّهَا. Ya Rasulullah, I'll make all of my salat, my dua. Salat, the meaning of salat in the Arabic language is what? Dua. The linguistic meaning of salat is what? Dua. وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ إِنَّ صَلَاتَكَ سَكَنٌ لَهُمْ. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Qur'an. He's telling the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ. He's not telling the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to go and to stand in front of them and what? Pray. وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ, meaning make dua for them. إِنَّ صَلَاتَكَ سَكَنٌ لَهُمْ. Your dua for them is a means of what? Sukoon, tranquility for them. Imagine a Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam making dua for you. Imagine Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam making dua for you. Like the Sahabi came and Abu Hurairah, he complained to Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he's forgetting. So Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam put his hand on his chest and he made dua for him. And he's forgetting what? Not in Allah, he's forgetting where his keys or he's not, He says, I'm forgetting the hadith and I'm forgetting the Qur'an and so forth. So Nabi put his hand on the chest of Abu Hurairah and he made dua for him. He said, from that day, I never forgot a single word. He said, from that day, and that's why Abu Hurairah is regarded as the most companion with narrations from the Prophet ﷺ. So this companion says, إِذَنْ أَجْعَ لَكَ, I'll make all of my dua for you, Rasulullah. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam قال إِذَنْ يُغْفَرْ ذَنْبُكَ يُكْفَى هَمُّكَ وَيُغْفَرْ ذَنْبُكَ. Your worries, your concerns will be dealt with and your sins will be forgiven. Your sins will be forgiven. Ibn al-Qayyim, the student of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, he has a book just on as-salat ala nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. When it is the family who's regarded as a family of Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, what are the terms of salat ala nabi? When is it sunnah to send salat ala nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? He mentions over 40 different places where it's sunnah or mustahab or permissible to do salat ala nabi. And then he mentions over 40 virtues for praising the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Imam al-Qayyim has a book. Imam al-Sakhawi has a book. Ibn Hajar al-Haythami has a book. All upon what? The virtues of praising the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So there are many things that the person can do if she's in the state of what? Menstruation or postnatal bleeding. Also it is with regards to reciting the Qur'an, now a lot of the contemporary scholars have said no, it's permissible. She can read off the phone and she can do this and kada. That's the opinion of a lot of the contemporary scholars like Ibn Uthaymeen, Ibn Baz and so forth. They gave the permissibility for the female, she can read. Within the four madhahib, it's haram. It's not permissible. The only madhab that makes it permissible, and it would be the same with the other madhab, is if a female or if a sister is memorizing the Qur'an. And she's memorizing every day a page or two. And she's doing revision and so forth. And then if she was to stop for 7 days, that's going to what? Affect her memorization. So during that period, she revises. It is permissible for her to revise during that period of time. And even to touch it, if she needs to teach, or if she feels that she's going to forget. If she feels, and that's only for the ha'id, for the female in menstruation, not for the female in major impurity. Major impurity, you can get up, have a shower, and that is gone. Al-hayd, it's there, you can't get rid of it. So the female in the duration of hayd, the Maliki madhab, they say if it's for teaching purposes, meaning she has a class, she can't stop that class, or if she feels that she will forget what she's memorized and she's memorizing the Qur'an, then she can recite and touch the mushaf. The other thing that is haram, we mentioned salat, fasting, recitation of the Qur'an, touching of the Qur'an is also regarded in the four madhahib as that which is also haram. To touch, and the same thing with the person who is on janaba, except if it's on a separate covering. If there's a separate covering, then it's permissible. And it's not allowed to hold it except for a necessity. Except for a necessity. If you fear someone, non-Muslim, is going to take it or is going to fall on the ground, then you grab it and you what? Put it somewhere safe. What's the dalil or what's the proof for this? The ulama have said that the proof for this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يمسه إلا المطهرون. Now there's been a long debate surrounding this, but the safe opinion is to stay away from touching the mushaf during the time of hayd, nifas or janaba. But touching it with putting your sleeve up and then holding it with your sleeve during that period, some of the ulama say it's makruh. Other of the ulama say that it's not makruh because that which is prohibited is directly touching. Directly touching. And that's with the mushaf. If the person is reading tafsir, then it is prohibited for them to touch where the verses are. And when we say tafsir, mean that the writing of other than the Qur'an is more than what? Than that which is of the Qur'an. Also which is prohibited on the haid and nufasa, on the female in menstruation and personal bleeding, and also the person in major impurity is to enter the masjid. To enter the masjid, except if it is a necessity. The Prophet ﷺ said, لا أحل المسجد لحائض ولا جنوب. I do not permit the masjid for anyone, for her to enter in the state of menstruation, or for the male or female in a state of what? Major impurity. Whether it's for sitting or just passing by, according to the Hanafi madhab. And we mentioned previously that the Shafi'i madhab allows if the person is just what? Passing by. And that's in if you go to the Arab countries and so forth, you'll find masajid in the marketplace. And you'll find that the masjid is open and there's doors on both sides. You can enter from one side and exit from the other side. Or you have to go around a big block. The Shafi'i said, no, if the person is just passing by, then that's what? Then that's fine. And that then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, illa abiri sabil. Except the person who's what? Who's passing by. Also, which is prohibited is tawaf. Even if it's what? A nafil. Why? Because tawaf is in the position of salat. And the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, at-tawafu mithla salat. The tawaf is like what? Salat. Illa anna Allah ta'ala ahalla fihi al-kalam. Except that tawaf, you're allowed to what? Speak. You're allowed to speak. But the person should not, if the person is going to speak, should only speak that which is good. Dhikr, Qur'an, dua, salat al-Nabi, so forth. So tawaf, to do tawaf, and to do tawaf in the first place, you have to enter what? The masjid. You have to enter al-Masjid al-Haram. Yani the haram in Mecca, the masjid in Mecca, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that named it al-Masjid al-Haram. Have you made the masjid the person who يعني أجعلتم سقاية الحاج وعمارة البيت كمن آمن. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He names al-Masjid al-Haram in the Quran as al-Masjid al-Haram. And so it's not permissible to do tawaf, and the reason though also is the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, when he went to Hajj, and with him was Aisha radiallahu anha, and on the way before they reached to Mecca, or as they reached to Mecca, she had her cycle. So Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said to her, you do everything that the Hajj does except what? إِلَّا أَن تَطُوفِ بِالْبَيْتِ. You do everything, Sa'i, Rajam, Arafah, Mina, Kada, everything except Tawaf. Except Tawaf. And then if you reach your purity prior to leaving Mecca, you go and you what? You do your Tawaf. You go and you do your Tawaf. And that's something that, the female, that's why a lot of the ulama are against the female using medication to stop their cycle when they go to Hajj. Why? Because the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, you do everything except Tawaf. And then if you're not able to do Tawaf because of that, you pay fidya. You pay kafara, and then you leave. And then you leave. So that's with regards to doing tawaf, also it is haram. Lastly, it is prohibited for the female during the duration of menstruation or postnatal bleeding to have any marital relations. It is haram. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يسألونك عن المحيض قل هو أذى فاعتزلوا النساء في المحيض ولا تقربوهن حتى يطهرن. And they ask you about the menstruation in the Quran. يسألونك عن المحيض, Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قل هو أذى. See, it is harm. It is a harm for the male or the female, for the male to go near his wife in that state, and for the male as well. So do not go near them until they reach the stage of purity. Once they reach the state of purity, then you can go near your wife. So it's haram during hayd to go near the wife and have marital relations with the wife. To have marital relations with the wife. Anything else is permissible, but only actual intercourse is haram. That's something that is prohibited, that's something that is haram. Now in Islam, that's what is only prohibited. The Jews, the Yahud, and this is why they asked about it. Because the Jews, when the female goes into a state of menstruation, she is separated from the room. And not the husband leaves the room. There's a room, it's called Garanat menstruation room. It's used once a month, and that's it. She's moved into that room now, doesn't sleep next to her in the same bed. Complete segregation. They don't eat with her on the same table. The Jews. She's got her own table, she sits and eats, the rest of the family, yani she puts the food and everything, they sit and eat, and then she goes and eats on her own. They don't eat with her. She's not to be eaten with or anything. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or that's why they asked about al-hayd. Because in Medina, there was a large number of Jews. There were many tribes, Bani al-Mustaliq, Bani al-Nadir, in Khaybar itself, there was a large number of Jews. So there was a lot of influence from the Jewish community. So a lot of things that they would ask would be because they saw the Jews doing so. So they would ask, okay, is it prohibited upon us? So the only thing that is prohibited is actual intercourse. But to put her in a different room, to send her away for those 7 days, and to not eat with her and to not gather, that's something that is prohibited. That's something that is haram. And a lot of other things, for instance, if a male and a female are having, there's issues and problems, one thing that the Sharia and the Deen also prohibits in some cases and dislikes is for the man to leave the house, to sleep outside of the house. And in many cases, the man has a problem with his wife, has an issue with his wife, leaves the house, goes to his mother's house, goes together, and he ends up staying there for a year. Ends up staying there for a year. One brother, subhanAllah, one brother 5 years. 5 years. Then when we called him, where'd you go? Stepped out to get food. 5 years later, where are you? He said, where'd you go? He says, I was waiting for her. 5 years? 5 years I was waiting for her to call me to come back, and he's still waiting. So that leaving the household and can create major damage on the marriage. Sleeping outside the household, separation and so forth, unless it's needed. Unless of course it's needed. So these are the matters that is prohibited during the time of menstruation and so forth. And inshallah ta'ala, next week we'll begin with the rulings of salat and the ahkam of salat, inshallah ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to continue, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to continue. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Every Muslim dreams to be up in Jannah, 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 Jannah. A pious person's destiny. Inshallah in Jannah, 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 Jannah.